So hello everyone, welcome back. We can move on with the next presentation. I am Onur. Julie, welcome. So let me introduce Julie Kallini to you all before we start. So Julie is a Stanford CS PhD student. She was previously at Princeton University, and also she worked as a software engineer at Meta AI, and she's now here with us. So thank you for accepting our invitation to speak here. So it's an honor to host you, Julie.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's really an honor to be here. And thank you so much for the invitation. I'll go ahead and share screen.
Yeah,
I want to make sure that you can see the slides change. Does the slide change when I press? Just to make sure.
Yes.
Okay, great. So yes, thank you again. I'm very excited to be here. I'm a member of the Stanford Natural Language Processing Group. I'm currently a first-year PhD student, and this is actually the first time I'm going to be giving this talk. The title is Mission Impossible Language Models, and it's based on a recent preprint we put out of the same name. So you guys are getting the first presentation I'm ever giving on this talk, and I hope you enjoy it. But before I jump in, I wanted to give a huge thank you to my wonderful collaborators, Isabel Papadimitriou, Richard Futrell, Kyle Mahwald, and my PhD advisor, Chris Potts. So I want to first open with the question, given how impressive large language models have become at generating convincing human language, what can they actually tell us about human language? So let's see what the highly influential linguist Noam Chomsky has to say about this. So he has recently made the claim that large language models cannot tell you anything about language and thought, and that this built-in principle cannot be modified, and that they work just as well for impossible languages as for possible languages. And we're particularly interested in that last part, which is quite a striking statement, and it's what he entirely bases his claim on. As I'll show you, there's kind of limited experimental evidence. So that's what we're going to dig into. And just to make sure that I really show you this has been said on multiple occasions. He has not just said this on one occasion. Here on the left, we have a quote from his New York Times article from last year, where he again asserts that LLMs cannot distinguish between the possible and the impossible. And other work from linguists has adopted the same arguments in their critiques of LLMs. So clearly this thought is becoming very pervasive. Anecdotally, my co-authors and I have heard this claim kind of going around in linguistic circles. So it's important that we actually investigate this. And just to make sure, what evidence does Chomsky provide in order to support these claims? Surely there must be some work on LLMs showing that they are very proficient at quote unquote impossible languages. Well, the sole experimental paper cited by the authors I mentioned previously is Mitchell and Bowers 2020, an important and inspiring paper, but not one that resolves these questions all on its own. So this paper studied recurrent neural networks and trained the recurrent neural networks on some unnatural languages, such as reversed sentences, arbitrarily repeated tokens, and randomized vocabularies. And what they showed was that the RNNs achieved high accuracy on a subject-verb agreement task. So it's important to note that, to our knowledge at least, previous studies haven't been conducted on the transformer architecture that is more widely used in LLMs today. On the other hand, to really contrast the evidence for the claim, what work would be undermined by the claims from Chomsky and others? Well, there's so much work in computational linguistics, as well as computational cognitive science, showing that LLMs are able to learn fundamental linguistic principles from data. I won't be able to go into each of these, but there's really a rich literature exploring the linguistic capabilities of LLMs and their utility in understanding the generalization of syntactic principles from data. So really stating that LLMs don't tell you anything about language and thought would really undermine this whole rich line of work. So let's restate the main problem. several authors have claimed that LLMs learn possible and impossible languages equally well, so they cannot teach us anything about language. The claim, if true, would have significant consequences for linguistic methodology and potentially also for the viability of LLMs as the basis for robust language capabilities. What we set out to do is actually put this claim to the test. So what we did was train some large language models on impossible languages and observed whether they are learned just as well as the possible languages. All right, first, throughout the introduction, I wouldn't blame you if you had been wondering what exactly is an impossible language. And that is indeed a hard question to answer, in part because it's difficult to really articulate what a possible language is. So I'm going to actually start with the question, what is a possible language? So in much of theoretical linguistics, all human languages are thought to have hierarchical syntactic structures generated through recursive rules. So if I have a sentence like the student presents her awesome project, there's a reason why the words appear in this order and communicate the meaning I want to express. And it's because there are these meaningful groupings of words that are hierarchically structured and can be represented by these tree-like objects. And each of these subtrees is called what we call a constituent. So yes, this kind of grouping is very meaningful in natural language. And constituency, or the idea that words come together to form meaningful units, is one of the universals of language, or properties that we believe are common across all languages. But truthfully, there is a lack of consensus on what properties of language are truly universal and which are impossible. And even a property like recursion, long considered to be fundamental to syntax, has come under question. But whatever these universals, whatever these universals are, would actually help us separate the possible from the impossible in human language and better articulate this problem. So now that I've laid some groundwork about what potentially the possible languages would entail, we'll grant that the possible languages are those defined by hierarchical recursive rules. Given that, what would we say are the impossible languages? Well, according to Morrow et al., which was one of the papers I mentioned in the introduction that made claims about LLM's abilities to learn impossible languages, the impossible languages would use the opposite type of rules, or those based on the linear order of words. And an older paper, Musso et al., investigated impossible language learning in humans using some artificial languages that they trained humans to acquire through like limited training examples. And they provide a few concrete examples that involve counting word positions to mark grammatical features. We actually incorporated some of these ideas into the impossible languages in our own experiments on LLMs. So, for instance, going back to the tree structure I showed a bit earlier, to test the learning of rules that involve linear counting of words, what we could do is introduce a rule that completely violates the constituent structure of language. So here's an example. In this sentence, the present tense verb has a suffix s, and that marks the tense. What if we removed that marker and moved it a fixed number of words later in the sentence? This would be a completely systematic pattern, but no language uses counting and inserting markers in this way to signify verb inflection. It's a completely unnatural pattern. But it would be minimally different from a natural language, right? So what we do is alter natural language data systematically in this way, as well as in other transformative ways, train a language model and see how this one type of change affects the model's ability to learn the weird language. So what I just showed you was one example of a language that involves linear counting rules, but I personally think that this is a narrow account of what is impossible. In our paper, we tested a much wider range of impossible languages, which we call the impossibility continuum. And in constructing these counterfactual languages in the continuum, we consider both their information theoretic attributes relevant to machine learning, as well as the formal linguistic characteristics that I've been talking about at length, such as adherence to hierarchical grammatical structures. And the specifics of this continuum will become clear in a second when I present to you our actual experimental languages, but I did want to draw your attention to the dividing line between the possible and the impossible languages. I think that this visual represents the fuzziness of the distinction between possible and impossible that I discussed further, and I think it's an interesting and open area of questioning that we start in this paper of where exactly the distinction is drawn, and can we discover languages that kind of bring us closer to the dividing line. So more concretely, how do we implement these experimental impossible languages? So what we do is specify impossible languages by defining perturbation functions that transform English sentences by incorporating unnatural word orders or grammar rules. So these functions map English input sentences to sequences of tokens. And in our case, we use GPT-2 models. So these would represent sequences of, or these would be sequences of GPT-2 tokens. And we separate our languages into three classes, which we call the star shuffle, star reverse, and star hop languages. And each class kind of digs into a different attribute, either inspired by information theory or from theoretical linguistics. So I'll first start with the star shuffle languages, which involve different shuffles of tokenized English sentences. And I'll demonstrate how each language performs its respective transformation using the example input sentence, "He cleans his very messy bookshelf." So in the first language, which we call the no shuffle language, this is really used as a control, so no manipulation is done to the input sentence besides tokenizing it. And in these examples, differently colored blocks represent different GPT-2 tokens. So next we have our first real impossible language, the non-deterministic shuffle language. And what this does is it takes the input sentence and randomly shuffles the tokens. But it's important to note that a different random shuffle is used for each sentence with no consistency across the inputs. So you can see that in these different sentences, which might be two distinct sentences present in the corpora, the tokens in the two sentences that were originally in the same position end up in completely different positions after the shuffle. So this transformation is entirely irreversible, resulting in sentences that are purely bags of words. So any structural information in the original linguistic signal is just completely irretrievable. So there is information that is lost through this transformation. So next we have the deterministic shuffle language, which also performs random sentence level shuffles of words with one important distinction from the non-deterministic shuffle language. So in the deterministic shuffle language, if two sentences have the same length, where length is measured as the number of tokens, the random shuffle applied to the sentence will be the same. So you can notice that these two sentences are distinct, but the mapping of tokens to their new positions is the same, as shown by those lines that are mapping from the original token sequence to the shuffled token sequence. You might have noticed that this language definition takes a parameter s. So s is the seed of the random shuffling function. So we can create multiple languages by changing the random seed used to generate the shuffles. And while the deterministic shuffle languages are created using a reversible perturbation function, this function operates in an entirely non-linguistic manner. Words are ordered based solely on the random seed and the sentence length, without considerations for linguistic features or information locality. And arguably, this is even less humanly feasible than the non-deterministic shuffle, since it relies on an arbitrarily complex yet consistent rule to determine word order, which could be argued to be even more difficult to learn. And we think that it's kind of an interesting question to think about how we would rank these two families of languages in the impossibility continuum. So next, we have the local shuffle language. So here, the tokenized input sentence is deterministically shuffled in local shuffles of a fixed window size W. So in this example, we have a window size set to 3, and the same deterministic shuffle is applied over intervals of 3 tokens. We again create several distinct local shuffles by varying the window size. And the local shuffle languages offer a finer grained test bed for the importance of information locality, since we can observe the effects of the window size on the language's learnability. And finally, we have the even odd shuffle language. Here, the tokenized input sentence is reordered such that all the even tokens appear first, followed by all the odd index tokens. And this is really more of an oddball language. It also manipulates locality, but interestingly preserves part of the linear order of English words while introducing new longer distance dependencies. So those were the star shuffle languages. And just to summarize, what these languages generally test are the model's sensitivity to word order, the reversibility of a given perturbation function, as well as information locality. I wanted to pause in case there were any questions. All right, if there aren't any questions, I will move on to the next set of languages. So here we have the star reverse languages, which involve reversals of all or part of input sentences. So we again have the same example sentence as shown previously. And first, we again have a control language, which we call the no reverse language. So here there's one more additional aspect. In this language, what we do is insert a reversal token in a random position in the input sentence. And we do this because it'll become clear in a second, but the other star reverse languages also have a random token insertion as a step. So we do this in the control language as well. And what that will do is control for the randomness caused by the insertion of these tokens. So here is the partial reverse language. And here again, we take the tokenized input sentence and insert a reversal token in a random spot. But this time we reverse all the tokens that follow the special reversal token. So what this language really does is trigger a reversal of the remaining tokens in the sentence. And this presents some interesting complexities where words that were previously very close together are now far away. And we introduce some long distance dependencies through this procedure. Finally, in the full reverse language, we do the same thing where we insert a reversal token, but now we reverse the entire sentence. So now it should be clear why we use this reversal token in all the languages. It's just to make these 3 classes of languages kind of comparable and controlled for that randomness. But generally, these star reverse languages test the importance of left to right word order. But even, full reverse may seem like a plausible language syntactically, but maybe higher level concepts like anaphora could be disturbed in non-trivial ways. And I wanted to note that partial reverse is inspired by the experiments of Mitchell and Bowers 2020, which was one of the papers cited by Chomsky and others that I mentioned in the intro. And what they do is devise a partially reversed language through the same procedure of inserting these marker tokens that trigger reversals. Although they directly compare the performance on that language to regular English, which might not be the best comparison since the token vocabularies would be different without the marker I mentioned before. And notably, they are doing these experiments on RNN language models. Finally, the last class of languages in our experiments are the star hop languages, and these perturb verb inflection using counting rules. So this class of languages is what I described when I first motivated the idea of an impossible language that uses counting. So we again have the control language called the no-hop language, and to perform this transformation, we first take the input sentence and lemmatize all the third-person present verbs. So essentially, this will get the root of the verb. And in this sentence, the verb cleans is changed to clean. And what we do is insert a marker representing the verb's tense and number right next to the verb. And here, the token is represented with S for singular, since this is a sentence with a singular verb. And then finally, we tokenize the sentence where the verb marker is represented by its own token. Next, we have the token hop language. Here, we lematize the third-person present tense verbs and insert a marker in exactly the same way. But this time, we insert the marker exactly 4 tokens after the verb. Finally, in the word hop language, we lematize the verbs, and this time we insert the marker for words after the verb, not tokens this time. It's for words. And you can see that this time the marker token didn't end up in the middle of the word bookshelf because we're counting based on words as the atomic unit. And for all of these languages, sentences that have plural verbs are defined analogously, but the marker token changes from S to P to signify plural in those cases. And this set of languages tests the ability of models to learn grammar rules that involve counting the positions of words or tokens. And in particular, the 2 experimental languages, token hop and word hop, can really probe at the sensitivity to tokens versus words as the atomic unit for counting. So next I'll go into the details of the experimental setup. So there is a general procedure that we follow for each impossible language. So what we do is we take those perturbation functions that I just described for each language. And for a given language, what we do is apply that perturbation function to each sentence of the 100 million word baby LM dataset. And what this does is it creates a synthetic impossible language dataset. And after generating this synthetic data, we train a GPT-2 small model from scratch for each synthetic dataset. So the GPT-2 model has had no prior conception of what English is. It has exclusively seen sentences that are in our in the specific impossible language. And we repeat this 5 times to get confidence intervals for our metrics. And we have 3 different experiments to evaluate how well GPT-2 learns each impossible language. The first experiment is more general, and then the following experiments probe deeper into the star hop models, which are probably the least intuitively impossible. So we go into a deep dive there. So in our first experiment, we try to get a general sense of whether language models reflect the impossibility continuum by observing whether certain synthetic languages are harder to learn than others. And the metric we use is test set perplexities, and this provides a general metric for the extent to which a model has learned an impossible language. And specifically, we measure the perplexities over model training steps. And this can give us a trajectory of how efficiently each language is learned over the course of the model's training. So let's take a look at the results. I'm going to present each language's perplexities incrementally, or in different steps. So first we have the no shuffle language, which, if you'll recall, was the control language that represented English. So this model's test set perplexities form a baseline to which we'll compare all the impossible languages. Next, we have the non-deterministic shuffle language, which has much worse perplexities than the control language and presents a significant gap. But if you remember, this language was clearly like destroying information in the input signal. So it makes sense that this language would be overall much less learnable. Let's take a look at the languages that kind of fall in between. Next, I have one instance of, or one example of a deterministic shuffle language. And I show the seed that generated the data set for this language. And it is quite lower than the non-deterministic shuffle language, which I think is in part due to the limited sentence lengths in the corpus. So in the deterministic shuffle language, the model essentially has to learn these mappings from original English sentences to shuffled sentences based on the sentence length. And if there tends to be a majority of sentence lengths, there are some sentence lengths that are much more frequent than others in the corpus, which probably creates some heuristics for where words end up showing up in the shuffles. But this was an interesting distinction that wasn't entirely intuitive, that the deterministic shuffle language would be easier, but we see this distinction. And just as a sanity check, we also trained a few other deterministic shuffle languages, again, by varying the random seed. And again, all three of the deterministic shuffle examples were lower than, or had lower perplexities than the non-deterministic shuffle. Next, I'm going to go into the local shuffle example. So here we have window size equal to 3. The local shuffles were much easier to learn by GPT-2 than any of the non-deterministic or deterministic shuffles that operate on the entire sequence of tokens in a sentence. Interestingly, though, if we vary the window size, here I added a window size equal to 5 and window size equal to 10. As we increase the window size, the test perplexities go up. So having shuffles that are in smaller windows and keep the tokens that were originally close together, keeping them close together, actually is helpful for learnability. And this touches on information locality and preserving, keeping the words that are predictive of each other close together. And finally, I also present the even-odd shuffle language. Again, this was kind of an oddball, but it does seem that even though there are long-distance dependencies introduced by this language, this sort of preservation of linear order to some extent does make it much more learnable than some of the shuffled languages. So that's the first test that kind of looks through each of the shuffle languages. We also did this for the star reverse languages. So here we have the control, which is the no reverse language. And both the full reverse and the partial reverse had higher test set perplexities. And interestingly, the full reverse language tended to have higher perplexities than the partial reverse language. And for the star hop languages, again, we have the control language and token hop and word hop. The distinction is very subtle, but you do have higher perplexities for earlier steps in the training. And the fact that, perplexity is a coarse-grained metric, we can go a lot deeper, especially with these star hop models that have a very subtle difference between each other. So that is exactly what we do in the next two experiments. So in experiment 2, we take a deep dive into the star hop languages and see whether the naturalness of the rule affects the language model's ability to master it. So what we do here is use surprisals to measure how well the star hop models can predict the placement of its verb marker tokens. And the reason we use surprisal as a metric is it's been used frequently in a lot of computational linguistics literature. It has been shown to correlate with human sentence processing difficulty, and has also been used to probe for syntactic information in neural models. And what we do is measure the mean surprisal difference between verb marker tokens and the following token for each of the star hop models over the training steps. And I'll show an example calculation just to make this more concrete. Surprisal is defined as the negative log probability of a word given the previous words. And what we can do with the star hop models, in this case, I take the control language, which is the no hop model. What we can do is create sentence pairs of grammatical and ungrammatical constructions. So I use the star, which means ungrammatical in linguistics, but by removing the token from where it's the marker token from where it's supposed to occur, we create this ungrammatical sentence that doesn't have a tense marker. And what we can do is get the surprisal of the marker token as well as the surprisal of the token that follows it. In this example, the surprisal of the marker token is this S token, and the surprisal of the next word or the next token is his in this case. And if the star hop model has learned the verb marking rule, we expect that the surprisal difference between the surprisal of the following token and the surprisal of the marker token should be a large positive number. So let's go ahead and look at the results. Here I present the results over the model training steps. And we can see that very early on, the control language, which is the no hop language, has much higher average surprisal differences as early as 300 training steps. And interestingly, the two experimental languages never quite catch up, but there is a distinction between the token hop and the word hop languages. So the GPT-2 model seems to be better at counting the positions of tokens, which makes sense because those are the atomic units that it operates on. And it does to some extent learn where to predict the tokens and the marker tokens in the word hop language. But it has to learn that over time because it's kind of constructing like this notion of word. But yeah, this experiment generally shows the overall takeaway of this experiment is that the control language, the rule in the control language is much easier for the GPT-2 model to learn, but still the fact that GPT-2 and language models operate on these atomic tokens does allow it to master, to some extent, the unnatural token counting rule. In the final experiment, we take another closer look. We go a little bit, even deeper into the star hop models, and really see what sorts of solutions are they developing in order to learn those rules, right? The last experiment showed that they can learn the natural rules better, but they still learn the unnatural rules to some extent. So how can we actually take a closer look at what the models are doing when they're processing those sentences? And what we use is causal abstraction analysis, which offers an interpretability framework for identifying and examining causal mechanisms in neural models. And the technique that we use is the interchange intervention, which identifies causal mechanisms in our hop models using a subject-verb agreement task. So just to make that a little bit more concrete, what is the interchange intervention? So we provide two different inputs to some model. In this case, it's a GPT-2. The two inputs are called the base and the source. You can imagine that we have two instances of the GPT-2 model, and they're fed each instance is fed the different sentence, the base input or the source input. And we know, given the rules of the language, that in the base sentence here, which is a singular example, the model should predict a singular marker token. And in the source sentence that has a plural noun, we expect the model to produce a plural marker token. With the interchange intervention, what we do is interchange hidden representations and at different points or at different places in the model and observe how that affects the output. So in this case, we have the GPT-2 model. We interchange the source, the second token position and the second layer of the source model into the representation in the base model at the same layer and token position. And we observe that that causes a change from the prediction of the singular marker token to the plural marker token. And what this tells us is that the representation at the second layer and second token position has a causal effect on the model's behavior. So we perform these interventions exhaustively at each layer and each token position in all three of the StarHop models to observe what parts of the model have a causal effect on the output behavior for predicting the subject-verb agreement for these models. I'm going to start with the results for the control, the no-hop language. And what I'm reporting here is IIA, which is an interchange intervention accuracy. This just means that we're aggregating the accuracy in the counterfactual in the case that the counterfactual were true, meaning did the model correctly predict a plural token given this interchange intervention, and we aggregate that over several examples. So here I have on the y-axis are the layers, on the x-axis are the token positions, and the three tokens here are like the token for the determiner, the token for the subject, and then the token for the verb. And what we see is in earlier layers, the token position above the subject is important for affecting causal behavior, and at the token position for the verb, later layers are important for affecting causal behavior. And we get nearly 100% interchange intervention accuracy starting around 1,500 training steps. Now that I've kind of explained that for the control model, we can compare that to the token hop model. The difference here is, remember, there are these 4 tokens in between the subject and the verb. And, you know, it's interesting to see that the model kind of develops a modular solution, right? It knows that it only needs to look at either the token positions above the subject or the token positions right before you predict a marker token. But interestingly, we still see that the interchange intervention accuracy is low overall, which just complements the last surprisal experiment. For the word hop model, we get the same effect as we saw with the token hop model, where there's still this modular solution that the model develops. But again, the interchange intervention accuracy is lower overall compared to the control. But it is interesting to see that the model develops a solution that we would expect. It knows exactly which token positions to look at, or the token positions that actually have an effect on the causal behavior. So those are the 3 experiments. I want to return to the motivation. I opened with this question about what large language models tell us about language. And what we've shown is that GPT-2s can distinguish between possible and impossible languages. The possible languages were more easily learnable by GPT-2. And what I believe our paper does is complement and defend a rich line of work that shows that LLMs learn syntactic principles from data. And we argue that there is value in understanding what systems like large language models can and cannot learn, challenging the previous unfounded assertions that I mentioned in the introduction. Still, large language models are fundamentally different from humans. It's very important to acknowledge that. And conclusions about LLM's linguistic competence and preferences for natural languages should be informed by an understanding of the ways that models differ fundamentally from humans. So in our experiments, we saw that GPT-2 can perform operations that involve counting tokens, which is very unlike humans. It is very unlikely that humans rely on atomic words or morphemes in the same way that LLMs rely on tokens. And it's important to consider and control for this difference before making generalizations or comparisons to human behavior. And why are the possible languages more learnable? This leads us to a question, since the possible languages were more learnable by GPT-2, what inductive bias of GPT-2 matches natural language? I've brought this up at different points in the talk, but we believe it is information locality, or the property that when parts of text predict each other, they're often close together. And we argue that the preference for locality is induced by GPT-2's causal language modeling training objective, which incrementally builds up representations of sentences, right? By observing like predicting the next word given the previous tokens. And locality has also been argued to arise in humans due to the incremental nature of real-time language processing. So looking forward, we see that LLMs are clearly relevant to investigations and claims about the necessary innate priors for language learning. And we believe that, or we have shown that LLMs can help us identify the possible versus impossible language boundary. I opened with this, I left this open question about where exactly is this boundary. It's fuzzy to us still, but language models can help us get closer. And we hope that in the future, if people have more proposals of impossible languages to try, we can employ this methodology and push the debate forward. Thank you for listening to this talk. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Julie, for this really fascinating talk. If you guys have any questions to Julie, you can unmute your microphone and ask your questions, or you can write your questions in the chat. Dr. Ümit Atlamaz has a question, so go ahead, hocam.
Hi, Julie. This is a fascinating talk. Thank you very much. I was actually thinking of doing something similar, but never had the time. So I have a bunch of questions, so I'll start with the first one. So a very simple question, right? Can a transformer model learn the underlying representation or the underlying probability distribution in a shuffling algorithm?
Right. So I think that's kind of why we had this separation between like the non-deterministic and deterministic shuffling languages. It's a question of whether it's actually in the deterministic shuffle languages that have these like clear mapping, or we know that there is a clear mapping from some more sensible English to a shuffled language. Is what the model doing? Is it recovering kind of this mapping? Is that along the lines of the question?
It's a trick question in the sense that, you know, we can use transformer models to model a bunch of different kinds of mechanisms. Maybe you can predict the next word in a sentence, but you can potentially also predict the behavior of traffic, or you might even be able to predict the behavior of the clouds. I don't know if it goes that far ahead, but essentially, if there is a way for the model to learn a completely random algorithm, right? That sort of like serves the purpose towards Chomsky's point in a sense that it's able to learn something that the humans can't learn with at least certain limited amount of lifetime and data.
Yeah, I think that what I think, and we need to, in follow-up work, I think, investigate this more deeply. But what I think is that there is information that is learnable from a bag of words, right? So when we see the perplexities go down for the non-deterministic or for the shuffle languages, it can be learning other aspects of the language that don't rely on word order. And then for the distinction between the deterministic shuffle language having these like clear mappings and somehow those being more learnable, I still think that has to do with some heuristics about similar tokens ending up in similar positions. But yeah, we definitely would need to go deeper to actually test that hypothesis, but that's just my thought.
Thank you. I got other questions, but I think I'm going to wait for my next turn.
I see some hands raised.
That can be possibly mine.
Yes, I think.
Thank you so much, Julie, for this very nice presentation. Actually, my question was about the point that you have been just talking about. So this when I see this performance graph about this non-deterministic version, I would have guessed it to be a flat line, like drawing parallelism with the, I don't know, in cryptography when you have like a fully random algorithm that's like you lose all the information. But then when I thought about it, maybe just the presence of these words like coming together also like present some kind of information. Then could it be like then you have mentioned about this information locality? Could this be a metric or I don't know, a pointer or something for the base information locality? So that's the worst performance that we can get. But like just the presence of these words like give some information, but these are just like my initial guesses, so I was just curious about like learning how do you like comment on this fact that it's not a straight line?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important that I state clearly these shuffles are done at the sentence level. So it's not that the entire corpus is shuffled. Individual sentences tokens are shuffled. So certainly, if a sentence is about a certain topic, like if it's about a chef cooking some food, right? Regardless of the order the order we present the words, maybe the words chef and cook are predictive of words relating to food. So the model has to, it will learn that somehow, I think, even in an unordered language, which is why I think perplexities do drop and we don't see a flat line. And then the questions of information locality are kind of probed at more closely by the other languages that only disturb or only shuffle words in local windows. So this kind of confirms that in natural language, pieces of text that are predictive of each other are coming closer together. And when we preserve that, we see that we see lower perplexities in the learning curve. Those are kind of my takes on those questions.
Thank you so much.
We have 2 questions in the chat. I don't know if you can see it.
Oh, let's see. I see. So I wonder if this line of research might help in understanding historic or diachronic syntactic change. That's interesting. So this work could definitely be extended to actual like possible word orderings in language. So there's been lots of work on word order universals and the learnability of different word orders depending on things like dependency length. So Richard Futrell, who is one of my co-authors, has done extensive work on this. And I wonder personally not so sure about how to link exactly to historical linguistics, but I'm sure there is like I'm sure there's going to be an avenue or a way to do that. Maybe through something like the thing that comes to mind, maybe this is a far out idea, is kind of like curriculum learning. So or transfer learning even, just like training on one language and seeing how well it transfers to a different language with a different word order might tell us something about what are more natural changes. That's my thought. And I see there's another question. So there's a question about, so the input linguistic signal is a sound wave, no obvious word orders or even phonemes. That is correct. And that is very different from the way text language models are trained, where we give them this bias toward these tokens, which we have determined by a tokenizer. And the brain separates data into words or things. Can this reading of the data be influenced by the syntax or semantics? I think I see. So I think there's a lot of interesting points there. So I think that the construction of a notion of a word in a large language model is a very interesting direction. So I'm actually working on right now on byte level models, which kind of don't have any notion of what a token is. With the whole point is to avoid tokens entirely. And this is closer to the way we might be interpreting sound waves or signals. Obviously, the speech models would probably be a better way to look at this too. But at least from my experience with the byte level models, it's kind of like a matter of whether we do like end-to-end learning versus telling the models about the notion of tokens. And I do think that LLMs could be a line of research in answering what the actual atomic units are, and how fluid syntax and semantics are. So I think these are definitely interesting questions, and definitely very interesting areas of future exploration. I think those are the questions in the chat. Are there more questions? I see hands raised. Yes, we can come back to. Is it Umit, or am I pronouncing it incorrectly?
Hi, me again. Okay.
Yes.
So a quick comment about the historical change. Jordan Kodner at Stony Brook does very interesting computational work on historical language change, although not with LLMs, a side note. I want to go back to this comment about the randomness, right? So the shuffling. So when you're shuffling the data, essentially you're removing some of the structural information, and while you're doing that, you're also removing some of the linguistic properties associated with the linguistic content. So actually, it's not becoming an impossible language, it's becoming not language. So not impossible language. I guess you might want to go the other way around. You might want to increase the complexity and structure, or play with the structure such that certain well-known universals are violated. I'll give you a few examples. They may or may not make sense, but just some direction maybe. So we know from languages that, are you familiar with island effects? I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you got island effects, right? So extraction is going to be bad, but you also won't be able to do any kind of control into the island. You also won't be able to do any kind of agreement into the island. everything is blocked. Now, think of a possible type of impossible language where some of these are possible and the others are not. So you can do extraction, but you can't do agreement, or you can do agreement, but can't do extraction. Could that be learned by a transformer or GPT? I bet they can. Or here's another type of possibility. In almost any language that I know of, you can go upper bound of like maybe 4 or 5 arguments per verb. Finding verbs with 4 arguments or 5 arguments is very rare. So I guess the best example is I bet you $5 that I can do this. Now construct an impossible language with 8 arguments that are associated with a verb. Logically, it's possible. And just distribute that on a positional argument structure, right? Not using prepositions or adjuncts or whatever. I bet that an LLM can learn that too. So there's a bunch of ways you could complicate the language and check to see if it's learnable, or at least harder or easier to compare with natural languages or the ways humans process. So I think, I mean, this is very exciting work, but I would make it more complex than shuffly.
I think that totally makes sense. I think the problems we encountered when first kind of doing these manipulations, maybe the idea of starting from English, while it provides some, it makes things easily comparable, right? Kind of how do we make sure we're doing these manipulations in a way that we're actually whatever new rule we're coming up with, are we applying it consistently? Is it making sense? Those were kind of the limitations in coming up with more complex languages of the type that you described. I do think it is interesting, large language models are very good at learning these structured but unnatural sequences like code. I think that's a very interesting direction too. And there has been work showing that, languages, let's say, that have, or like from the formal languages perspective, like more complex nesting, and like these are systematic but just more complex rules, like more deeply nested structures are just harder for the model to generalize to, like new examples in the formal languages. There's definitely lots of more interesting directions there. But yeah, thank you. I think that's a great comment. I think
Yusuf is also
I had another
maybe
question.
you can comment on your question.
Yeah, feel free to unmute and state your question. I'm also reading it in the chat.
Well, I wrote it already, and if you are reading it.
Okay. Yeah, I think these are very interesting comments. Yeah, I think that I don't know much about how large language models have been applied to historical linguistics, but I think these are definitely, I think, interesting directions. Were there other questions from anyone in the room?
Well, I have a little question and comment. I'm asking the questions because what is in my mind is, for example, if you read anything about phonology or historical phonology, the changes are always described as they have already happened. So, for example, if a P became an F in, say, a basic sound change, it just happens. It's a possible change. It's described, but we still don't know at all why this change happens in a specific language. For example, does the semantics of a language affected. For example, if a very common 2 or 3 different words can become what was the word? Can have the same sound. If they have the same sound, the meanings might get jumbled. For example, if the becomes an F and 2 very common words can have the same sound, they might have same meaning, but the phonological works so far haven't been able to quantify this because it's very complicated. So I was wondering whether this statistical approaches, because until now the classical linguistics has not been so statistically inclined, because the framework and the say equipment wasn't so practically available. So I know these are very open-ended questions, but I still wanted to ask and just leave as a comment, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. Like, so you're essentially saying certain phonological changes might introduce ambiguities that make resolving the semantics harder. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I suppose that a statistical approach could help. Like, if you, let's say, are training a model on some data, you can compare performance after you've introduced some performance in some. You come up with some downstream task that might involve some semantic knowledge after you've introduced your if you then like compare to a model where you've introduced some singular phonological change in the data. And I think about phonological changes because I've been working with like some byte level models now. So these changes would actually matter for those models over token models. And then see if semantic information is still just as present in a way that is important for your task. But I suspect that language models, these sorts of differences might be very subtle. But I do think that could be an interesting direction.
Thank you.
All right. If there are no other questions, are there any other questions? There also. All right.
A very quick, complete curiosity question, if you don't mind. You mentioned that you're working with byte level models.
Yeah.
A very silly question, but I'm very curious. Do byte level models babble like the babies do, or make up certain types of units that are different but in a predictable way?
That's so interesting. So currently I've been working with like pre-trained byte level models and just kind of doing like some interpretability analysis, like layer-wise analysis on those models. I haven't actually like trained one from scratch and saw the progression of how it's learning. But I think that would be super interesting. They're also not, to my knowledge, very popular byte level models that are decoder only. Either they're encoders and meant to get like character representations or entire sentence representations, or they are text to text or sequence to sequence models, like based on top of a model like T5. But training one from scratch and observing those sorts of progression in learning, I think, is also something I've been thinking about. Are there any other questions?
I have another short question, if you might.
Sure.
I wonder if these models are completely deterministic. So, for example, if you feed the model the same data for, say, a dozen times, will it always have the same output for say, if you try it with an input? So if you train it on same data for several times, will it always be trained the same, or will there be differences, randomness?
So that is a good question. So there's always issues of reproducibility in machine learning, but if you guarantee that you are training on the same exact hardware, same parameters, there should be no difference. But if you do train on a different piece of hardware, due to some numerical precision, there will be differences. But these experiments would be I think they would be exactly reproducible on the same hardware.
Yeah, I wanted to ask this question because I had in my mind, for example, if we think about, again, the historic language change, I always wondered whether particularly the fundamental changes of language, say a phoneme becomes another, or say a syntax changes, the word order changes, negative marker changes, etc. Does it happen, say, during, of course, it's quite hard to define on a societal level, but does it happen during the lifetime, say, during a person has already learned the language and using it? Does it happen during that time, or does it happen when the language is, say, relearned by a baby? And so I wondered if there is if there is randomness on the same data set, then learning, there might be the difference, the source of historic change might be from the statistical errors in the continuous learning of the language by new babies. But that's just a hypothesis, a very general one.
Right. So if you want to introduce randomness, you can also just vary like the initialization parameters, and then you can see how much of your what you observe is dependent on just those metrics and luck of the random initialization. Yeah.
All right then. Thank you, Julie, for again being here for this amazing presentation. Sorry for being over time, but as Compec and as Boğaziçi University, again, we thank you for being here. So I guess this is it. Thanks, and have a nice day.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to speak to you today, and thank you for the wonderful questions.
Oh, thank you. For the audience, I'd like to remind, so this is the final presentation for today. I'd like to remind the audience the presentations for tomorrow. We will be hosting Vadim Kimmelman from Bergen University, who will be giving a presentation on non-manual markers in sign languages with computer vision. We will also host Alison Das from University of Maryland, who will be giving a presentation on language models and language acquisition. And finally, the final speaker for tomorrow will be Büşra Marşan from Stanford University, who will be giving us a presentation on benchmarking in Turkish. So thank you to the audience members for joining us tonight.